The morning I found the second phone hidden inside my husband's gym bag, wrapped in a gray sock like something too shameful to be seen in daylight, I did not scream, I did not cry, I simply sat down on the edge of our bed and read 3 years of messages that told me my marriage had been a performance and I had been the only one who didn't know the script. That single moment, sitting in a quiet bedroom with sunlight pouring through the curtains, changed the entire direction of my life, and if you believe that a woman who has been betrayed can still rise, rebuild, and reclaim her dignity, I want you to like this video, leave a comment about what strength means to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, and subscribe to our channel. Because our community is built on stories of kindness, forgiveness, hope, and the courage to begin again. My name is Margaret Whitfield, though everyone who has ever loved me calls me Maggie, and for 11 years I believed I was building a life with a man named Charles Ashbourne, a man I met in my final year of university when he was studying law and I was studying architecture, both of us young and hopeful and certain that the world owed us nothing but effort. We married in a small stone chapel outside Bristol with rain threatening the entire ceremony, and I remember laughing with him under a borrowed umbrella, thinking that a life built on laughter like that could never truly break. We built a home together, a modest brick house with a garden I filled with lavender because Charles once told me lavender reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, and for years I believed we were happy in the ordinary, unremarkable way that most good marriages are happy, filled with small routines, shared coffee in the morning, arguments about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and quiet nights reading on the same worn sofa. It was on a Tuesday morning in early spring that everything I believed about my life unraveled, not through some dramatic confrontation, but through the mundane accident of doing laundry. Charles had left early for what he called a business trip to Manchester, and I was gathering his gym clothes to wash when my hand brushed against something hard and rectangular hidden inside a rolled sock at the bottom of his bag. I remember feeling a strange, cold curiosity, the kind that whispers you should not look at this, and yet I did, because some deep and ancient part of me already suspected the truth before my mind could admit it. The phone was unlocked, careless in the way that only a person who has never once considered being caught can be careless, and the messages I found were not from a stranger or a passing flirtation but from a woman named Isla Bennett, a colleague from his firm whom I had met twice at office holiday parties, a woman with kind eyes and a warm laugh who had once complimented my dress and asked about my work with genuine interest. The messages spanned back nearly 3 years, filled with tenderness that should have belonged only to me, filled with plans for weekends I remembered as business trips, filled with a phrase that broke something fundamental in my chest, a message from Charles that read, "I love my life with Maggie, she is steady and good and I will never leave her, but you understand me in a way she never could, you are the fire I need." I sat there on the edge of our bed for nearly 2 hours, the morning light shifting slowly across the wooden floor, and I did not cry immediately, because grief that large does not arrive all at once, it arrives in waves, and the first wave was not sadness but a strange, hollow disbelief, as though I were reading a story about someone else's life. When the tears finally came, they came violently, and I found myself gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white, staring at photographs of my husband and this woman in places I recognized from his supposed work trips, smiling at cameras with an ease that told me this was not a secret shame to him but a second life he had built in parallel to mine. A life where he could have both the comfort of a wife who managed his home and the excitement of a lover who asked nothing of him but passion. I understood in that moment, sitting alone in the home I had spent a decade building with lavender in the garden and photographs on every wall, that Charles had never truly chosen me, he had simply arranged his life so that he never had to choose at all, keeping me as the foundation and Isla as the flame, believing perhaps that a man clever enough could have both without either woman ever knowing the cost. I want to pause here and ask you, if you have ever felt like the steady one in someone's life, the one who is loved for your reliability but never truly seen for your fire, please leave a comment below, because I believe there are more of us than we realize, and I believe our stories matter. I did not confront Charles the moment he returned from his trip, because I am not a woman who acts from raw emotion, I am a woman who was trained by grief to think clearly even when my heart is breaking, and so I spent the following days gathering evidence quietly, screenshotting messages, printing photographs, contacting a solicitor named Rosalind Carver who my sister had recommended years earlier for an unrelated matter and who I now called with a steadiness in my voice that surprised even Me. Rosalind listened to my account with the calm professionalism of a woman who had heard 1,000 similar stories, and she told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that betrayal reveals character, but the response to betrayal reveals strength, and she promised to help me build a case that would protect not just my heart but my future. During those days of quiet preparation, I continued to live beside Charles as though nothing had changed, cooking dinner, discussing mundane household matters, even allowing him to kiss my cheek before leaving for work. And I want to be honest with you, this was one of the hardest performances of my life, because every smile I gave him felt like a small betrayal of myself. Yet I understood that acting rashly would cost me leverage I desperately needed. Charles noticed nothing unusual, because men who believe themselves clever rarely imagine the women beside them are equally capable of strategy, and this blindness, this quiet arrogance, would ultimately become his undoing. I discovered through Rosalind's careful guidance that the house we lived in, though registered under both our names, had been purchased primarily through funds I had inherited from my late father, a fact Charles had conveniently forgotten over the years as he grew comfortable believing everything we owned was equally his by default. I also discovered, through documents I found while searching his study one afternoon while he was at work, that Charles had been quietly transferring money into a separate account for over 2 years, money that should have gone toward our shared savings, money he had likely been using to fund weekends away with Isla, to buy her gifts, perhaps even to build toward a future he intended to eventually reveal once he decided the timing suited him. The realization that he had been financially deceiving me alongside emotionally betraying me hardened something inside my chest, transforming my grief into a quieter, more purposeful resolve, and I remember standing in that study, sunlight falling across his desk, thinking that I would not simply survive this betrayal, I would ensure that when I walked away with everything that was rightfully mine, and Charles would be left to understand precisely what he had thrown away. It took 3 weeks of careful preparation before I was ready to confront him, and I chose a Saturday afternoon deliberately, because I wanted daylight, I wanted clarity, I wanted no shadows in which he could hide his expressions or soften his lies with the comfort of dim lighting. I asked him to sit with me in our garden, among the lavender I had planted with such hope years earlier, and I placed the phone on the table between us along with a folder Rosalind had helped me prepare. I watched the color drain from his face as he understood what I had discovered, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply staring at the folder as though hoping it might disappear if he refused to acknowledge it. When he finally spoke, his first instinct was not remorse but justification. He told me that Isla made him feel alive in ways our marriage no longer did, that this did not mean he loved me any less, that surely a man could love 2 women in different ways without either love being diminished. And I remember feeling something between fury and pity as I listened to him rationalize a decade of deception as though it were a reasonable philosophy of love rather than a betrayal built on lies. I told him calmly, though my hands trembled beneath the table, that love is not a resource you can divide in secret without theft occurring on one side, that keeping me as his wife while keeping her as his lover was not an expression of a generous heart but an act of cowardice, because a man who truly loved 2 women would have the courage to be honest with both rather than deceiving one to protect his comfort. Charles tried, in the moments that followed, to shift from justification to desperation, promising to end things with Isla, promising that our marriage could be repaired, promising that I was overreacting to what he called a mistake rather than understanding it as a pattern spanning years, and I want to share with you something I realized in that moment, sitting among the lavender with the folder between us. I realized that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing, that I could eventually forgive Charles for my own peace without ever returning to a life built on his lies. I informed him that I had already begun divorce proceedings, that Rosalind was prepared to demonstrate both his emotional betrayal and his financial deception, and that given the house had been purchased substantially through my inheritance and his hidden accounts represented a clear pattern of marital dishonesty, I intended to pursue what was rightfully mine rather than accept whatever token settlement he believed might quiet me into compliance. Charles's expression shifted from desperation to something colder, a flash of the entitlement he had likely always carried beneath his charm, and he told me I was being vindictive, that I was punishing him rather than simply moving forward, and I remember answering him with a steadiness that surprised even myself, telling him that reclaiming what belongs to you is not vindictiveness, it is justice, and that he had mistaken my years of patience for weakness when in truth I had simply been choosing peace over conflict until peace was no longer possible. If you have ever had to find that same steadiness within yourself, standing in a moment where your whole world was shifting beneath you, I want you to know that you are not alone, and I hope you will share this story with someone who might need that same reminder today. The weeks that followed our conversation in the garden were among the most difficult of my life, not because I doubted my decision but because dismantling 11 years of shared history is a process filled with unexpected grief, even when the marriage itself has been revealed as a betrayal. I grieved the version of Charles I had believed I married, the young law student who once stood with me under a borrowed umbrella in the rain, and I had to slowly separate that memory from the man he had become, understanding that perhaps that young man had never fully existed in the way I remembered him, or perhaps he had existed and simply been lost somewhere along the way to comfort and entitlement. My sister, Vivian, became an unexpected anchor during this period, driving up from London most weekends to sit with me in the garden, bringing homemade soup and blunt, loving honesty that I desperately needed. She reminded me, during one particularly difficult afternoon when I found myself doubting whether I had the strength to see the divorce through, that I had spent 11 years supporting Charles's career, managing our home, maintaining relationships with his family, and quietly setting aside pieces of myself in service of a partnership I believed was mutual, and that reclaiming my life now was not selfishness but long overdue justice for the version of myself I had set aside. Her words settled into me slowly over those weeks, becoming a kind of quiet mantra I returned to whenever guilt tried to creep in, whenever some old, conditioned part of me whispered that I should simply forgive and move forward for the sake of peace. Rosalind, meanwhile, proved to be not just a skilled solicitor but an unexpected source of strength, walking me through each stage of the process with patience and clarity, explaining that Charles's attempts to paint me as vindictive in front of mutual friends were a common tactic among people who wished to avoid accountability, that betrayal often tries to disguise itself as the victim's overreaction rather than accept its own weight. Through her guidance, I learned that the house, given the clear documentation of my inheritance funding its purchase, would very likely remain mine, and that Charles's hidden accounts, once fully documented, would work significantly in my favor during settlement negotiations, not as instruments of revenge but as simple, undeniable evidence of the trust he had broken on every level of our shared life. There is a particular kind of pain in watching someone you loved reveal, piece by piece, that the version of them you cherished was only ever a performance for your benefit, and I experienced this most acutely when Charles's mother, a woman named Beatrice who had always been warm toward me, called to ask if there wasn't some way to save the marriage for the sake of the family, and I found myself explaining, gently but firmly, that a marriage built on years of secret betrayal was not something that could be saved through my forgiveness alone, that saving it would require Charles to reckon honestly with what he had done, something he had shown no genuine willingness to do beyond fearing the consequences of being caught. Beatrice, to her credit, grew quiet on the phone and eventually told me she understood, admitting with evident sadness that she had noticed changes in her son over recent years that she had chosen not to examine too closely, and this small moment of honesty from her meant more to me than she likely realized, because it confirmed that I was not imagining the slow erosion of the man I had married. As the legal process continued through the summer months, I found myself rediscovering pieces of my own identity that had quietly dimmed over the years of marriage, returning to architectural sketches I had abandoned when Charles once suggested, gently but persistently, that my career ambitions might be better suited to a smaller firm closer to home so I could better support his demanding schedule at the law office. I had agreed at the time, believing it a reasonable compromise for the sake of partnership, not recognizing until much later how many similar compromises I had made across the years, each one small and defensible on its own, yet together forming a pattern of gradual self-diminishment I had never consciously chosen. Now, in the quiet mornings alone in the house that would soon legally be entirely mine, I began sketching again, first tentatively, then with a hunger that surprised me, designs for a community library I had once dreamed of building, sunlight studies for reading rooms, garden spaces meant to bring people together, and I realized that reclaiming my life meant not just reclaiming property and financial security but reclaiming the woman I had been slowly setting aside for over a decade. If this part of the story resonates with you, if you have ever felt yourself dimming to accommodate someone else's comfort, I want you to know your light is still there waiting to be reclaimed, and I would love for you to share in the comments what part of yourself you are working to rediscover. During this period, I also began, slowly and cautiously, to understand more about Isla Bennett, not through bitterness but through an unexpected conversation that occurred when she reached out to me directly, asking to meet in a quiet cafe near the river on a bright Thursday afternoon. I almost declined, uncertain whether I had the emotional capacity for such a conversation, but something in me, perhaps the same curiosity for truth that had led me to open that phone months earlier, compelled me to accept. Isla arrived looking nothing like the confident woman in the photographs I had found, instead appearing tired, anxious, and considerably younger in spirit than I had imagined, and she told me, with what seemed like genuine remorse, that Charles had told her early in their relationship that his marriage was essentially over in all but paperwork, that we were living separate lives under one roof for practical reasons, and that he intended to eventually divorce me once circumstances allowed. She explained that she had believed him, had built her own hopes around a future she thought was gradually being prepared for her, only to realize over recent months, through small inconsistencies and unexplained absences, that Charles had likely been telling her a version of events as carefully curated as the version he told me. I listened to her account with a complicated mixture of emotions, understanding that she too had been deceived, though in a different way, and that our shared betrayal at the hands of the same man did not make us allies exactly, but it did dissolve some of the anger I had initially directed toward her, redirecting it more fully toward the man who had orchestrated deception on two fronts simultaneously. Isla apologized to me that afternoon, her voice breaking slightly as she admitted that even believing what Charles had told her, some part of her had always known that pursuing a relationship with a married man carried its own moral weight regardless of his framing, and that she deeply regretted the pain her involvement had caused me even as she had been navigating her own confusion about his intentions. I did not offer her easy forgiveness that day, because healing does not move at the pace we wish it would, but I did tell her that I appreciated her honesty, and that I hoped she would use this experience to demand greater honesty from anyone she chose to trust in the future, a lesson I was equally determined to carry forward in my own life. We parted that afternoon not as friends but as two women who had survived the same storm from different angles, and I remember walking home along the river afterward feeling strangely lighter, as though understanding Isla's perspective had removed one more piece of unnecessary weight I had been carrying. The divorce proceedings reached their conclusion in early autumn, nearly 6 months after that Tuesday morning when I first found the phone hidden in a gray sock, and the settlement, guided by Rosalind's careful documentation, ultimately confirmed what I had hoped for. The house remained fully mine given the clear evidence of its purchase through my inheritance, and a significant portion of the funds Charles had hidden away over the years. Funds a forensic accountant Rosalind brought in. Confirmed had been systematically diverted from our joint accounts, were returned to me as part of the settlement. Charles, for his part, grew increasingly bitter as the proceedings continued, at one point accusing me in front of our shared friends of having planned this outcome from the very beginning, of having married him for financial security rather than love, an accusation so divorced from the truth of our early years together that I found myself almost laughing despite the pain still lingering beneath the surface, because the man who had spent years living a double life was now attempting to rewrite history to cast himself as the victim of my supposed calculation. Our mutual friends, to my quiet relief, largely saw through this narrative, several of them reaching out privately to express support and, in a few cases, to admit they had long sensed something unsettled beneath the surface of Charles's charm, small comments he had made over the years that they had dismissed at the time but now understood differently in light of everything that had come to light. This period taught me something important about the nature of community, that the people who truly know your character will recognize truth even when someone attempts to obscure it with confident reframing, and that I did not need to convince everyone of my innocence. I simply needed to continue living with integrity and allow that integrity to speak for itself over time. I want to take a moment here, before we continue toward the ending of this story, to ask you something meaningful. If you have ever had to rebuild your sense of self after someone tried to rewrite the story of your worth, please leave a comment below sharing what helped you find your footing again, because these stories we share with each other, in comments and in conversations, are themselves a form of the very hope and second chances this story is about. As autumn deepened into the following months, I found myself settling into a rhythm of life that felt entirely my own for the first time in over a decade, waking in a house filled with morning light, tending to the lavender in the garden that had somehow, through all the turmoil, continued to bloom stubbornly each season regardless of what had happened around it, and slowly building toward the community library project I had begun sketching months earlier, eventually partnering with a small architectural firm run by a woman named Cordelia Ashworth who had heard about my designs through a mutual acquaintance and reached out with genuine enthusiasm about collaborating. Working alongside Cordelia over the following months brought back a version of myself I had nearly forgotten existed, a woman energized by creative problem-solving, by the particular satisfaction of watching an idea move from rough sketch to structural plan to eventual groundbreaking, and I found in our professional partnership an unexpected friendship as well, two women who had each, in different ways, learned to rebuild their lives after difficult chapters, Cordelia having navigated the loss of her husband some years earlier and having built her firm from the ground up in the years since. Our conversations during long afternoons reviewing blueprints often drifted into deeper territory, discussions about resilience, about the particular strength required to begin again in your 40s rather than your 20s, when the path forward feels less certain and the weight of years already invested feels heavier, and I found genuine comfort in her perspective. In her insistence that beginning again at any age is not a failure of the years before but simply an honest response to what those years have taught you. It was through this slowly rebuilding life, filled with purposeful work and renewed friendships, that I met a man named Theodore Langley, though I want to be clear that this story is not ultimately about replacing one relationship with another, because healing does not require a new partner to be considered complete. But Theodore's presence in my life during this period nonetheless became meaningful in ways I had not anticipated. He was a structural engineer who joined our library project as a consultant, a quiet, thoughtful man some years older than myself, recently divorced himself after his own marriage had ended not through betrayal but through the slow, sad drift of two people who had simply grown into different versions of themselves over the years. Our early conversations were entirely professional, focused on load-bearing considerations and material sourcing, but over the months of working together, a genuine friendship developed, built not on the intensity of early romantic infatuation but on the steadier foundation of mutual respect and shared values. I want to share something Theodore said to me during one particular afternoon that has stayed with me since. We were reviewing plans for the library's central reading room, discussing how to maximize natural light throughout the day, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had come to believe good partnerships, whether in architecture or in life, were built the same way good buildings were built, through honest foundations rather than impressive but hollow facades, through materials that could bear real weight rather than decorations that merely looked strong from a distance. I remember feeling struck by how simply he had articulated something I had spent the past year learning through painful experience, and though our relationship developed slowly and carefully over the following months, eventually becoming something more than friendship, I want to emphasize that what made it meaningful was not that Theodore rescued me from loneliness, but that I had already rebuilt enough of my own foundation that I was able to enter this new relationship as a whole person rather than someone seeking to be completed by another. If you believe, as I do, that healing must happen within ourselves before any new relationship can truly flourish, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has moved you in any way so far, please consider sharing it with someone in your life who might need this reminder today. The community library project reached completion nearly 2 years after that difficult spring when my marriage first began unraveling, and I remember standing at the entrance on opening day, surrounded by neighbors and city officials and children eager to explore the new space, feeling an overwhelming sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with Charles or the pain he had caused and everything to do with what I had built in the aftermath of that pain. The library included, at Cordelia's insistence, a small dedicated area named the Whitfield Reading Garden, an outdoor courtyard filled with lavender bushes similar to the ones in my own garden, a detail she had included as a quiet tribute to the resilience she had watched me demonstrate throughout our partnership, and I remember standing in that courtyard on opening day, sunlight warming the stone benches, feeling tears gather in my eyes not from sadness but from a profound sense of having transformed pain into something that would genuinely benefit others for years to come. During this same period, I learned through mutual acquaintances that Charles's relationship with Isla had ultimately not survived the aftermath of our divorce, that the foundation of deception upon which it had been built proved unable to sustain an honest, everyday partnership once the excitement of secrecy was removed, and that Charles had since struggled both professionally and personally. His reputation among colleagues quietly diminished by the way our divorce had ultimately become known within our social and professional circles. I want to be honest with you, there was a small, human part of me that felt a flicker of something like vindication upon hearing this news, but I also want to share that this feeling faded quickly, replaced by something closer to simple acceptance, an understanding that Charles's choices had created his own consequences separate from anything I needed to feel about them, that my peace no longer depended on his suffering or success, and that this realization itself represented perhaps the most complete form of healing I had achieved. Vivian, my sister, once asked me during a quiet dinner nearly 3 years after the divorce whether I had truly forgiven Charles, and I remember sitting with that question for a long moment before answering honestly that I had forgiven him in the sense that I no longer carried daily anger about what he had done, that I had released the weight of resentment because carrying it further would have only continued to cost me pieces of my present happiness for the sake of a past I could not change. But that forgiveness in my understanding did not mean forgetting or pretending the betrayal had not fundamentally altered the trust between us, it simply meant I had chosen my own peace over continued bitterness, a choice I made not for Charles's benefit but entirely for my own. This distinction matters deeply to me, and I want to share it with you because I believe many people struggle with the idea that forgiveness requires reconciliation or that healing requires pretending pain did not happen, when in truth, genuine forgiveness can exist alongside firm boundaries, alongside a complete and permanent ending of a relationship that caused harm, alongside a clear-eyed acknowledgement that some breaches of trust, once revealed, cannot and should not simply be smoothed over for the sake of convenience or social comfort. I share this not to suggest that anyone who chooses reconciliation after betrayal has made the wrong choice, because every situation carries its own unique circumstances and every person must find their own path toward healing, but simply to offer my own experience as one valid way through such pain, a way that allowed me to release bitterness while still honoring the reality of what had been broken. Before I bring this story to its close, I want to ask you something important, something I hope you will sit with for a moment before scrolling past. What is one lesson about strength, forgiveness, or self-worth that this story has stirred in you today? And I would be so grateful if you shared that reflection in the comments below, because these stories become so much richer when we build them together as a community, when your experiences and insights join with mine to create something larger than any single story could achieve alone. Theodore and I eventually built a life together, though we chose to do so slowly and intentionally, marrying nearly 4 years after we first met on that library project, in a small ceremony held in the very courtyard we had helped design together, surrounded by lavender in full bloom and by the people who had walked alongside me through the hardest and most transformative chapter of my life. My sister Vivian standing as my witness with tears streaming openly down her face, Cordelia offering a toast about foundations built on honesty rather than facades, and even Beatrice, Charles's mother, sending a warm card of congratulations that I keep still, a small testament to the unexpected grace that can emerge even from the wreckage of broken relationships. I think often, even now, about that Tuesday morning years ago, sitting on the edge of my bed with sunlight falling across the floor, reading messages that shattered everything I believed my life to be, and I recognize now that this moment, as devastating as it was, became the beginning of a version of myself I had not known was possible. A woman who could face betrayal not with permanent bitterness but with clear-eyed strength, who could dismantle a life built on lies and construct, piece by careful piece, a life built on truth, purposeful work, genuine friendship, and eventually, love that did not require deception to sustain itself. I do not believe Charles's betrayal was a gift, because I refuse to romanticize pain in a way that suggests suffering is necessary for growth. But I do believe that how I responded to that betrayal ultimately became one of the defining achievements of my life, proof to myself that I possessed a strength I had not fully known I carried until circumstances demanded I discover it. If you have made it this far in the story, I want to thank you sincerely for sharing this journey with me, and I want to remind you, as we close, that whatever betrayal or heartbreak you may be carrying, whatever version of yourself you have set aside to accommodate someone else's comfort, that reclaiming your own life, your own worth, your own quiet strength is always possible, no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult the path appears in its earliest days. If this story touched your heart in any way, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the lesson or emotion that resonated with you most, share it with someone in your life who might need to hear today that second chances and rebuilding are real and possible, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of kindness, forgiveness, hope, and the courage it takes to begin again. Our community continues to grow because of stories like this one, because of people like you who believe, as I have come to believe, that even the most painful chapters of our lives can ultimately become the foundation for something far more honest, far more beautiful, and far more truly our own than anything we lost along the way, and I carry that belief with me still. Every morning I wake in a home filled with light, in a life I built with my own hands from the wreckage of what once seemed like an ending but turned out, in the end, to be simply the beginning of everything that came after.